Hello, everyone. Welcome to What's My Lab Do? Um, I am Nicole, one of the lead peer advisors for the department.
And I'm Kelly Rose, also a lead peer advisor for the department.
As an overview, the What's My Lab Do series, it's like some projects in which we work alongside with professors and faculty members. They get to talk more about their lab and their research. Also, in the case that any students are interested in joining, today we are lucky to have Professor Hwang, um, and she'll be talking more about the Diversity and Development Lab. And I'll just pass it along to her.
Great. Thanks so much for having me. And I'm so excited to talk about our lab and the research we're doing here. So let me go ahead and share some slides I prepared. Okay, cool. Everyone can see my slides okay? Perfect. All right. So as Nicole and Kelly introduced, I'm the principal investigator or the professor in charge or responsible for my lab, which are called the Diversity and Development Lab. Um, and I wanted to sort of give a preview of kind of the work we do, and then I'm happy to answer any questions about the research and also just general hidden curriculum, which is things about like how do you apply for grad school or how do you get to do research, stuff like that too. So happy to do that as well. So a lot of the questions in our lab come from this big question about what is driving us here today with all the social inequities occurring. As we know, there's been a lot of big social movements about a lot of systemic issues about how social biases come into play. So people being mistreated based on their identities of race, religion, immigrant status, and much more. And what we're trying to think about in our lab is how do we get to that point when we start from here, something like this. And so what our lab broadly studies is three big themes. First, kind of this overarching idea of how does these early emerging cognitive and affective mechanisms that help us navigate the world also could help hinder us from creating a more equitable society. And specifically, what that looks like is we look at some of the development of these social biases starting from infancy. And we really focus on how early environmental diversity across not just your, micro level of your family and your parents, but to the wider context of neighborhoods, community, and culture, and how these processes occur both for racial majority and minoritized individuals, because we know that experience has a really different impact on these populations. And then some new lines of work that I'll mention that we're developing is how children are thinking about these bigger systemic social inequalities, how they're thinking about politics, actually, how they're thinking about partisanship, political ideology. And one direction that we're really excited about is also how we can apply that to help encourage political activism. And to research these questions, we also use different methods across psychology and neuroscience, and we'll preview some of that in my introduction here. But we use methods like interviews with kids, EEG, which is a neuroscience tool to look at brain neuroactivity, electrical activity through the scalp. And I'll talk about why this one is particularly useful for infants. And then also like we talked about, kind of going beyond just the micro level to think about social networks and neighborhood level statistics to see how that connects with the individual. And here's our team so far. We have a couple of graduate students, Annie, Samantha, and Toby here, as well as Sierra, who's our current lab manager, and Ian, who's a junior specialist, who's a part-time research manager here at the lab. And then most importantly, our research assistants. We have a lot of research assistants, including Nicole, who I think will talk a little bit about her experience. Just because there's a lot of us, I put out this link, so feel free to go check it out, and you can see everyone's profiles there. We do need to update it with more new people that we have this quarter. But I did want to put it this way because the most important people are the research assistants on top. And then I'm down here trying to support everyone doing the great work everyone's doing. And so today I wanted to talk about some current research we're doing in the lab. This is funded by the National Institute of Health. And the three studies we'll talk about first is EEG study, so a neuroscience study used with infants to try to understand in the very beginning, how are they starting to even think about race, people who are coming from a different racial background. And then study 2, which is to then trace it to a little older in toddlers, so more 12 to 13-month-olds. How are they starting to react to people from different racial backgrounds? And then we'll conclude with study 3 that we're just finalizing and hoping to launch soon, which is trying to think about older 5 to 10-year-olds who we know from previous research are starting to show racial biases, if we can educate them about systemic racism and how effective that will be. So let's talk about our first study that's going on in the lab, which is with infants, and how we're looking at EEG. So EEG is this cap you see here on the baby. And this particular cap we have is a saline-based solution. And you can see the little circles here are different electrodes. And what these do basically is they're passive recorders. So all pretty much acts like a heart rate monitor where it makes contact with the scalp and it can get electrical activity that happens in the brain. That gets propagated that this little electrode can capture. And then as you can see, there's a lot of them so that we can really see the electrical activity that occurs across the brain regions. And as you all probably know from some of your classes, different regions of the brain are related to different processing. So what this tool allows us to see is how infants' brains are reacting and what kind of potentially mental processes are going on. And this is really exciting technology because, as you all know, infants 7 to 12 months can't tell us anything yet, right? They can definitely express, right? They can cry, they can smile, right? But it's hard to kind of know what more is going on in there, right? But we know from a lot of infancy work that there is a lot going on there, right? They're already starting to learn so fast and processing things. And so this tool really allows us to get a peek inside their brain even before they're able to tell us more. And so this builds on 3 different EEG research and EEG oscillations that's been studied well before. And the first one we look into is something called top-down attention. And so this is a level of attention that's more infant-driven. So not something like just registering or seeing a stimuli, but when infants are looking at something and trying to remember it, we see this frontal theta oscillation happening a lot. And as you can probably guess from the frontal part, it's really markedly sits in the front part of the brain. And then another cool component that we see a lot in infants is motor activation, or something that's linked to motor imitation. And that's linked to a EEG oscillation called mu desynchronization. And those tend to happen around more central sites, so a little bit further back here. And the really cool thing about this mu desynchronization is that it occurs when you're watching movement that you yourself isn't making. And it seems to suggest, especially sensitive to people and intentional movement. And so there's been a lot of exciting work suggesting we know infants really learn a lot by imitation. So some of these EEG activities that we know are related to imitation could help us understand how much are they thinking about these issues, these people, and these actions in a way to be intentional. And then third aspect we can also see from EEG is something called approach withdrawal that's indexed by frontal alpha asymmetry. And what that means is, as you can see again from frontal parts, but it's an asymmetry. So if we see more left or right activation, for example, if we see more left activation, we found that relates to more approach motivation, whereas if we see more right activation, seems to be related to more of a withdrawal response. And that's been done in some classic studies where they have the baby in this EEG cap, and then a stranger comes up And it's a little scary for the babies. And some babies, if they're really scared, they seem to show corresponding withdrawal behavior that's also related to this frontal alpha asymmetry, as well as more approach if they're looking at their mom or someone that they want to go towards. There's a more approach happening there. And so what the cool thing about these three components is then even if the infant is sitting there, and so as some of you might know from interacting with infants, they might not always have the biggest expression change or movement change. We can still see if some of these brain activities that we know go on could be involved in how they're processing someone from a different racial background. One of the interesting things that we've been trying to explore is some theories that suggest maybe a lot of how infants are reacting to the people who are unfamiliar or different is just really emotion based, right? It's just based on how familiar or unfamiliar people are, and that's really driving a lot of the responses. Whereas some groups and other research using EEG as well as looking time and other measures have shown that infants really are very thoughtful. They are trying to figure out, okay, is this person giving me useful information or not? Is this person going to be helpful for me to learn from? And so what this study is trying to intend to do is try to see what processes are sort of involved when they're seeing someone from a different racial background. Are they also thinking about how informative this person could be, or are they kind of being overwhelmed by how much they're emotionally responding to these people? And so what I'll talk about is some new studies here. A past study we've done where we have the infants look at either someone from a similar racial background. For example, this infant, the parents identify as white, could either be someone who's an in-group, so another white experimenter, or someone from a different group, an Asian experimenter. And then we want to see, are their EEG activities going to be similar or different? So we're trying to assess how much they're reacting differently to these people. I'm just noticing the comments, so sorry for those I missed it. Let's see. How does your study define familiarity? Yeah. So in terms of familiarity here, we're talking about whether the people share the same racial identity as the strangers here share the same racial identity as the parents. And then we are also doing some measures of social network to see how much racial diversity do they have, and that would affect how familiar they might find certain racial backgrounds. So we're definitely interested in looking at that further. Do we generalize cognitive ability about bilingual and monolingual participants in your studies? Yeah, cool, great question. So I don't have the slides for that here, but we also have another study that I'm collaborating with people at University of Chicago where it's the same logic, but the infants are seeing someone who's speaking their same language. So if it's an English hearing infant, they're hearing an English speaker versus a Spanish speaker, and we want to see, are they going to show differential EEG responses? But what we're actually seeing is that it's really dependent on their language background. So the infants who do have more bilingual experiences are showing more. And here we didn't look at language status. That's a really interesting question. If bilingual kids will be more open to race as well, and that's some newer research coming out that suggests maybe versus some that suggests no. So I think that's an interesting area to look into further, and it probably depends a lot on different contexts, like different cultures. Language is more linked to race, and other cultures, language is not so linked to race. So that could be also important factors of why we might see some differences there. Cool. Yes. And yeah, definitely I'll make sure there's some time for Q&A too. If anyone wants to ask more questions, happy to answer those as we go along. All right. So what we see here from this study that was done back in 2021 is that we did see differences in frontal data according to in and out group and according to neighborhood diversity. Actually, the neighborhood diversity was really the most important part, which again, perhaps is familiarity than this clear distinction of who's in group, out group. And what we see here, as you can see in the frontal areas, that there's greater activation, which is indicated by warmer colors, for infants who are in high racial diversity areas to the Asian experimenter or the outgroup experimenter, compared to the ones who are in lower racial diversity areas. So what that suggests is that white infants who view someone who is an outgroup, an Asian experimenter, if they have a lot of diversity in their neighborhoods, they're more likely to show frontal theta, so more likely to show this kind of intentional attention to the person. And then we also see the same pattern for mu desynchronization. And one thing to read about these graphs is that the desynchronization indicates cooler colors. So what we see here is there's more desynchronization across the central areas, especially for those who are in the high racial diversity areas. So what this means again is white infants who are seeing an outgroup person, and if they live in a high diversity area, they're more likely to try to imitate the action or process that action. The interesting thing though is we didn't see any effects of frontal alpha asymmetry. And so what we're doing now is currently we're trying to collect tooth parts, get more diverse samples. So in that previous study that I talked about, it was mostly white infants and we didn't have a lot of racial minority infants. So currently in our lab, we're trying to have more infants from racial minority backgrounds and to also include more stimuli from different racial backgrounds. So as you know, as you probably noticed in that previous study, we only had white and Asian experimenters, but in this new study that one of our grad students, Samantha, is leading, we're having people from East Asian, South Asian, white, Asian, Latine as well. And a lot of our population, which is drawing from the area here, are coming from Latine backgrounds too. So we're able to really see how those infants from that background are thinking about and processing people. And then, as I mentioned, frontal alpha asymmetry wasn't as strongly elicited. And so we're trying to do a new study where we do want kids to feel like it's more of a social kind of interaction environment. So now they're watching also videos of a stranger kind of approaching, saying hi to them, as well as playing some peekaboo, kind of this social interactive actions to see if we can elicit more of this emotional responding as well. So in a second study we have going on in the lab, we're interested in how from infancy now that they're going to toddlerhood, how their behaviors might be changing according to different race. And one way we can look at that is a very early emerging behavior called wariness towards strangers or stranger fear, you might have heard in your classes. And what we wanted to see here is if kids will show differences in how wary they are to the people they're seeing according to the racial backgrounds of both themselves and the people they see. But also another thing we know is how you respond to strangers also depends a lot on infants' temperament. So kind of this early emerging tendency a lot of infants have, and some infants tend to really be wary of new things, whereas some infants really like new things and they gravitate toward that. And that's sort of a stable individual difference that often can be traced through early childhood, and then some have seen links to actually adult personality as well. And so in this study, we were able to look at a big data set of 2 to 10-year-olds. And what we found was that kids who are shyer, as reported that by their parents, were more likely to show awareness to the different race stranger than those who were less shy. So what we're saying here is not a very black and white, just because they're seeing someone from a racial outgroup, they're going to be more wary or more fearful. But it's actually really dependent, it's interacting with the infant's own individual temperament. So the shyer the kid is, the more they were showing wariness. So kind of going closer to their mom, not likely to play with the stranger, less likely to spend time around the stranger than those who are kind of more outgoing and they were kind of open to interacting with the person. And those infants were really kind of open regardless of who they were seeing. And now in this next segment of the study we're doing now, we're really interested in how 12 to 23-month-old toddlers are doing. So in the slightly younger age range than what the previous study did. And as I mentioned, we're really interested in how their social network and diversity in their neighborhoods could also modulate how much of their awareness is occurring, not just their temperament and individual difference. And then the third study that I'll talk about that's also ongoing and opportunities for people who are interested in joining the lab to participate is a new study we're doing on systemic racism education to change children's anti-Black bias. And this comes from sadly, a lot of research suggesting when people, especially white families, talk about racism, it's really predominantly talked about at the individual or interpersonal level. So talking about racist incidents or things people say and not really acknowledging the inequalities existing in the laws or in historic rooted inequalities that still come out today. So what thing we want to figure out from this study is, can we help educate children about these systemic issues early on? Because understanding what the causes of the inequalities that they see, because we know from previous research that by age 5, kids do know there is a black and white wealth disparities, but they don't really know why, unfortunately. And so this study is trying to see if we can tell them explicitly about these issues early on, which traditionally a lot of families have kind of shied away from. Can that be really helpful? And so what we're doing here is working with 5 to 10-year-olds to see if we can teach them about systemic racism in a child-friendly way, because we know from other research that even 5-year-olds understand their structural causes to inequality. So versus something that's really inherent to the person. So they know if 2 people worked really hard and one person got more because they worked hard, they understand, that's a fair cause. But if they hear that the teacher who's distributing it tended to like boys more, so they gave more to the boys, that understand, okay, this is not about what's the boy and girl difference, but it's really about the teacher and how that teacher's processing. So they're trying to understand that there's things outside the individual characteristics. And so we're really excited about this work. We've been planning this for a long time, try to fine tune it to make sure we're hitting on really important components of critical race framework, like saying race is a social construct that is not biologically based, making sure they understand the systemic nature of racism, that it occurs in these systems and history. And then lastly, emphasizing that this is something that occurs still now and not something of the past, which again, unfortunately, a lot of white families tend to engage in. And so with that, I want to give a little plug for how our lab is always looking for research assistants. And especially in that stranger study I talked about, we really want to make sure kids coming from all backgrounds get to see people who are from their own backgrounds as the strangers, as well as offer kids opportunity to interact with as many people as possible. So we're always looking for people who are interested in helping us with this study. We usually have research assistants join through the Psych 194 credit program. Happy to talk about that. And then you can also apply, and I can send this link out in the chat, where on our website as well, we have a little form for those who are interested. So if you submit a application, we're happy to, we always go through it towards the end of the quarter for hiring for next quarter. But yeah, I'm happy to answer any questions about the studies going on here. I already had great questions in the chat here. But yeah, any questions about things in general? Let's see. I see there is a question about, is wariness a kind of opposite of altruistic behavior? Oh, yeah, really interesting question. Yeah, it's interesting because in some of these experimental studies done with children's altruism behavior versus wariness, they are pretty much same coin, different side, right? So infants who are going to be wary towards someone are less likely to help that person in situations. But I do think there are different parts. So it's the idea is you could still you could maybe not show wariness difference, but you could show altruistic differences, right? So you could imagine a case where, say, an infant who's really outgoing didn't show any wariness differences, like they didn't make a difference in terms of how much they're approaching or talking to someone, but they might show less helping behavior towards someone from a out group than an in group when they have to put more effort in or do something that's a little bit of a loss to them. So I think that's sort of open questions, and it could go, I think, either way, and that'll be really interesting to look at further. Yeah, I can send the links through the chat as well for those who are interested. Yeah, any questions?
Yeah, I have a question. When does like when does this have like a beginning and an end, or like is this like a continuous like thing?
What can you say a little bit more about what you mean by
Or
this?
like is there like a deadline, or like are we just like continually like researching? Sorry, that's like a dumb question.
No, no, no. I see what you mean. I see what you. Yeah. Is there an end to kind of our understanding of the? I think there are a lot of multifaceted parts to it. I think these are really great. That's a really good question. And something I think about too. So in terms of is there an end to this research? There isn't a big. I think it's there's a lot of theoretical questions that keep coming up. But in terms of practicality, yes, I think some of these studies, for example, um, like the EEG study, we probably will end that study after we collect, say, like, our aim is to collect 80 usable infants, right? So that will be the end of that particular study and what we can conclude from that. But I think the hope is that, even if my time comes and pass, there'll be your next generation of you all who will want to continue doing this research and continue expanding our knowledge. Does that help answer your question, or if you want to clarify or add something more?
Yeah, no, that was a great answer. Thank you.
I will stop sharing so that I can also share the slides on the chat, but feel free to ask me questions.
While we wait, if students have questions, we also have some pre-planned questions we'd like to ask you. One of them is, how do you think COVID has affected children?
Oh, great question. Yeah, I think we definitely are seeing some numbers come out from education side, right? There's a public reports about the national grade card. So definitely we've seen losses there, especially in reading and comprehension. It seems like even more so than math, which is really fascinating. In terms of some of the infancy work, um, that's I think been encouraging. Is that there's a lot of worry during COVID that infants, because they were seeing a lot of faces with masks, that they won't be able to see as much like emotional expression or be able to pick up as much of the facial cues that are going on. But there's been some cool studies that come out that even young infants are pretty good at noticing emotion from the eyes only. And so even if the person is masked, but if they're smiling, they definitely notice that and can differentiate that from someone who's like angry or sad. So it really does show that, yeah, infants are pretty great at noticing these social cues, and that even if, and I think one of the practical applications of that is like, yes, so please stay masked. Is not necessarily resulting in a loss for the infants or children to see people with masks, which is, I think, an important, theoretical question, experimental question we could have answered, that this research suggesting is yes, masking is still not so detrimental to emotion processing as people have originally thought, which is good in terms of what we know about pandemics and what we can do to keep our community safe. Yeah, and I think another interesting question, especially with some of my line of work, is some of these infants and children were really limited in the social contact during very formative years, right? During their first, some of the children didn't really see anyone until like they're 5 or 6 because of COVID and how the timing happened. And what does that mean for their understanding of like social relationships? I think those are some interesting ongoing questions that are going on. I do think for that young age group, it's not always necessary for them to have a wider community to develop, safe attachment and, good relationships. But I do wonder about some of our neighborhood effects, right, with these infants. So these young infants that we see at 7 to 12-month-olds are already showing differences in their brain, reflecting how diverse their neighborhoods were. And that study was done before COVID. And we definitely got less effects of neighborhood diversity during COVID when we're doing some of these studies. So it's a really interesting question about how much of that early exposure will then have long-lasting consequences. And that hopefully we'll be able to know in a few more years after we follow up with the kids.
I have a question that I can ask. So what's a correlation that you've seen in your results? Does a particular race or ethnicity respond similarly?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, so what we see often is some of these diversity effects and in and out group effects seems to be strongest for white infants. And oftentimes that's because a lot of the white infants' close social networks have not a lot of diversity. And so we think that's why for these white infants, living in a neighborhood that's diverse can be really important. Whereas for some of the racial minority infants, the in and out group effects aren't very strong and the neighborhood diversity doesn't seem to matter as much, which is often because we think their close network also just happens to have more diversity for a lot of minoritized individuals.
Yeah, and just to get some insight on what a lab is like, what does a typical day in the lab look like?
Yeah, so our lab, as I mentioned, currently we're doing some infant EEG studies. So you might come in and they tend to come in the mornings because babies are freshest in the mornings. And so what that will look like is we'll have a team who's an EEG team that's been trained to help make sure the waiting room is nice and clean for the families to come in and then help consent the family through the studies or describe what the study is about. And then we have some helpers in case the family brings in another older sibling. Um, and that we can help make sure those families can come in and have some sitting help there. And then two experimenters usually go into the room with the baby and the caregiver, and they sit the infant down and they sort of help put the net on. It's all kind of a cool experience to do that. And then help run through, make sure the EEG data is collecting. So you might see that. A lot of the research assistants will help us with recruitment. So helping contact families, helping us schedule these families to come into the lab. And then some might also help us code the data. So we get a lot of video data after these sessions, especially, for example, the stranger awareness session. As I talked about, a lot of our research assistants help be one of the strangers. So there's a protocol. They kind of go into the room, act in a similar ways to make sure we can compare across people from different racial backgrounds. And then one of the things we'll ask their help is looking at those videos and coding or helping us look through the demographic information. We also do a lot of interviews with kids. So oftentimes the research assistants might help transcribe and then help us code through their responses. And then we do weekly lab meetings, and those are journal articles that we read or give feedback on research projects or presentations that people have, conference presentations that might be coming up. So it's a good safe space for people to practice that. Yeah, and then we probably will wrap up the day and try to have some time to like come together as a community in some of these lab meeting times. Yeah, and I think a lot of the people in our lab are very interested and active, so they're also applying for research grants for the summer or other opportunities like giving presentations in Sci-Chi. So that's all important work that we want to support in the lab. So we help mentor people through that as well. Great. And I see in the chat, what qualification skills are you looking for in research assistants? So for us, our main thing is people who are comfortable with infants and children, because as you can tell, a lot of our work involves research assistants helping us run and work with infants and children. So that's kind of one of the big things we look for, people who are comfortable doing that. But yeah, other skills I really think we can help teach you through that, and that's something we want to make sure we can help mentor people through it. So don't feel like you have to have certain qualifications to apply. I think that's part of what we try to help in our lab, is to help people gain some of these research analytical skills. Great. Yeah, and I'm trying to, I can't post my slides on the chat for some reason. I'm not sure why. I think maybe I can't attach things, but could I send it to the peer advisors and they can send it out to people? Great, I will do that now.
I can definitely talk about my experience being in the lab. This is my first quarter being in the diversity and development lab. Kind of just like to go back to the day-to-day question. Usually we get assigned a couple of tasks by our lab manager. Our schedule does consist of like 9 a.m. to like 1 p.m., sometimes a little bit after, depending. Like I'm currently working on database entry and just basically going through the database and making sure that all the data that we have, data like about the participants and the infants and like the caregivers, is all accurate. I'm also working on contacting participants, which consists of emailing them, texting them, and calling them on a set schedule that our lab manager organizes. I have some coworkers, some other people in the lab working on coding some RAI results. I'm not sure if you talked about RAI, Professor Hwang. But yeah, they're just watching videos and just coding the results. Oh, I've done a stranger awareness session, which was very fun, but a little bit hard because you're not able to, the study consists of like not interacting with the child or the infant as much to create like an unbiased, result. So you kind of have to keep a straight face with the infant for the beginning of the study, which is kind of hard, especially if you love infants and hanging out with kids and interacting with them. For my case, for the last session, I was an in-group, so the child was of Hispanic descent. And I believe, yeah, the out-group participant or who was running the session was East Asian. Surprisingly, the child approached my lab partner first, who was of East Asian descent, and not the in-group stranger, which was me, which is very surprising. But it was interesting to see. But yeah, definitely developing a lot of new skills in the lab, such as database entry. I wasn't very familiar with it, but I'm getting more familiar with it now. Also just interpreting results. I'm definitely seeing a lot of progress in my lab in these last few weeks, and it has been a wonderful experience. Yeah, very grateful to be in it.
Oh, thanks, Nicole. Yeah, and I agree. Yeah, I think it's always cool to see there's so much like each individual child brings something so unique. So oftentimes you might see it on average, but like at the individual child, there might be a lot of other factors going on, right? Maybe they had in their social network, someone who's East Asian, or they live in neighborhoods that have a lot of East Asian people. So it could be like interesting to see that's also a factor that could have gone on. Yeah. Oh, quick question about, are we still hiring people for the remainder of the quarter? We're not, unfortunately, for winter quarter, but I think we'll open back up for spring, and then definitely we're already starting to think about summer. So if any of you are interested in being in Santa Cruz for the summer, do apply. But if you're really interested, feel free to put your application in. I will actually send the link here right now. then we can also reach out to you because we'll have a record. And then, yeah, any specific deadline? It's sort of we usually, like I mentioned, kind of look through at the end of the quarter, probably like week 9 or 8 for the next quarter. So yeah, I would say if you're really interested in joining us in the spring, try to get your applications in by like February 28th. That'll just help us then plan some interviews, etc. And what might happen is we do get a lot of applications. So some of the things we also look for is just scheduling time-wise. So as I mentioned, a lot of the times we're working with infants and toddlers, so the families just prefer coming in the mornings. And so people can have morning availability is just really helpful. So sometimes what ends up happening a lot is we might have everyone's really qualified, but we might just prioritize people who just have that availability to help out with some of those studies. So yeah, that's something you can keep in mind. But yeah, I would suggest if you're interested, apply by like February 28th for us to consider you for the spring. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Professor Hwang, for sharing.
course.
Yeah, if we miss anybody's questions, feel free to hang back after the presentation. But for students looking for research opportunities, I can share my screen. You can go to this QR code and it'll lead you to our website, which has posted research opportunities that I can also include in the chat with the QR codes being funky. And if you're also interested in looking for other research opportunities, I know they're not always posted or updated on the website. So another way would be to get in contact with faculty or staff, go to their office hours, go to visit your TAs and kind of have a conversation, get to know them and see if they have any lab openings or if they have, just ask some questions about their research. And that's another way to potentially get into a lab. Okay, thank you. Right, that concludes our What's My Lab Do event. Thank you guys for coming out. We really appreciate you all for taking the time. And thank you, Professor Hwang, for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me and organizing. And I'm so sorry again for the late start.
No problem. And yeah, the recording will be posted on our department website in case you missed anything. And if there aren't any questions, everybody have a good day. Thanks for coming. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your week.